you. We are convening, I mean, we don't have that specific mechanism invoked, but we're doing a lot in the UN Security Council. We're doing a lot with various multilateral partners, and we had a very strong statement out of ASEAN at the recent ministerial in October in Manila. We have gotten a lot of different actors to step up and help us with this effort. Certainly, we're doing a lot of consulting with the regional stakeholders, especially our two very strong allies, South Korea and Japan. The President met with them both in a trilateral format last week in New York. But we've also been consulting very closely and had long meetings and had extended discussions with both Russia and China. I think we're doing as much as we can with those regional stakeholders, but we don't want to be tied to one particular format. And we're certainly open to any formats or opportunities that would put pressure, more pressure on North Korea. And so I think we're open to it. We just haven't found it necessary to do it in that format.
Do you concur with Ambassador Haley that the United Nations has exhausted its usefulness?
Well, I mean, I think she was referring to the issue of UNSCRs that could be passed and increasing the level of sanctions within the UNSCRs. I think we all agree that almost all of North Korea's external hard currency earning trade has been captured in one way or another through UN Security Council resolutions, and I think there's probably some more that could be done there, but mostly it's been already incorporated into the UNSCRs we have so far. The main task I see going forward is on implementation.
No, I concur. And with that regard, Secretary Mandakela, you have lots of authorities, but do you have a priority? I mean, most important is to identify or go after this company, second important is this company, and shipping is the third, et cetera. Can you give us that kind of strategy, not just we've got lots of things we can do?
Yes, Senator. So we are constantly thinking about how we can exercise our authorities to achieve maximum strategic impact. We're looking at the biggest revenue generators to North Korea and taking action against those revenue generators. We're very focused on sanctions evasion. Of course, the reason part of the reason we're in the place that we are today is that North Korea has been incredibly adept at evading our sanctions, and we want to cut that off at the pass. And so we are focusing on high revenue generators. We're focusing on going after those financial facilitators that they have planted all over the world. We just announced designations of 26 of those this week that were situated in different countries. And again, always focused on maximum strategic impact. So just as an example, in August, we went after 3 coal companies that had generated $500 million worth of revenue to North Korea, and we designated them to cut them off again at the pass so that they can no longer generate that sort of revenue. So yes, focused on highest priority impact always.
Those 3 companies, you've effectively shut them down, or you've just indicated to them we're going after you?
We've indicated to them that they cannot have access to the U.S. financial system, and we've sent a very strong message that it is our view that no one should be dealing with any company that's continuing to trade with North Korea.
But companies are still dealing with those companies.
I can't tell you in an open setting whether or not companies are still dealing with those companies, but the message is clear. We will go after any company that does trade with North Korea.
I think that's a good message, but again, I think apropos of some of my comments to my colleagues is, specific evidence that it's working. I mean, Senator Toomey mentioned that the growth in their economy was not insubstantial last year, and we've been messaging for 2 decades.
I agree with you, Senator. Look, that is why in this administration we are taking the strongest measures we have ever taken. We have had many UNSCRs in the past, and they have not worked. These are the strongest UN Security Council resolutions we've ever had. The executive order that the President signed last week is the strongest across-the-board executive order that we've ever had. We are taking this with utmost seriousness, and we're pushing countries all over the world to do the same.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Corker.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you both for being here. Do we all agree that, in essence, North Korea is a de facto nuclear state?
Sorry, is that for me? I guess.
Well, look,
She
we all
already-
know what the threats are, Senator,
answer
and
is
they have been able to proliferate at an unprecedented.
Yeah, I don't
Stage.
want to get into a long debate, but is it, we do agree they're a de facto nuclear state, is that correct?
I don't think that's the position of the State Department. It involves a number of different technologies, and I don't think that we would be able to say with concrete certainty that that's the case.
Well, I'm going to state that they're a de facto nuclear state. That would be my position. I applaud the efforts that are underway, I really do, and as you know, work closely with Secretary Tillerson and others. You know, every one of our intelligence agencies tells us publicly even, that there's no amount of pressure that can be placed on the leader of North Korea to get him to stop. He views this as his ticket to survival, and he's changing the balance in the peninsula. So I applaud the efforts that are underway, I really do. Is there any course of action, though? We've been doing this now for 25 years that I applaud. But is there anything you see that is changing, possibly changing the dynamic that exists where they're, in the very short term, are going to have a deliverable to the United States nuclear weapon without a change in trajectory? I mean,
Well-
Tillerson's working against, and I applaud what he's doing, but he's working against the unified view of our intelligence agencies, which say there's no amount of pressure that can be put on them to stop. And so I'm just asking, is there some dynamic out there that you see is going to overwhelm that unified view and change the trajectory?
I think that is the intelligence community's assessment, or at least the assessment of many of them. But I think what we are doing is testing that assessment, and I think what's changed is the sort of growing level of international isolation and pressure, especially from the leading enabler of North Korea up to this point, which is China. And I think we do see China, as the Undersecretary mentioned earlier, policy shifting. We're trying to turn China's position from looking at North Korea as some kind of asset to looking at them as a liability. I think that Secretary Tillerson has made a lot of progress on that front, and so the pressure that is being applied now to the Kim regime is greater than at any time in the past, and we need to test that proposition, I believe. So that's what we're up to.
Is denuclearization of the peninsula still the absolute objective?
Yes.
Is it helpful, you know, Congress has taken the lead on many things. There's no question that Congress took the lead for years on Iran. I don't think there's any way, without the pressure of many people on this committee for a long, long time and on the Foreign Relations Committee, I don't think there's any way that we would have ever gotten Iran into a place to negotiate. Congress passed some sanctions on Russia recently. Congress passed additional sanctions. The House actually took the lead on North Korea. I'm at the point personally where I wonder whether additional congressional activities is helpful when we're on the brink of something that could become a catastrophe. I applaud all those people who want to play a role. I do, and I'm not in any way being pejorative as it relates to that effort. But from your perspective, is it helpful for Congress to pass additional legislation right now? And I know no administration ever wants Congress to do anything. I got that part. But are there heightened concerns Congress taking additional steps as it relates to sanctions?
Well, what I would say is that we all want this to be resolved diplomatically and peacefully. We think that this maximum pressure campaign is the last best chance to resolve this peacefully, but what that also means is that eventually we will need to get into some diplomacy, and we will need flexibility when we get to that point. So I think we want to keep in mind that, we want to get to the diplomatic solution, and when we get there, Secretary Tillerson will want to, have space to negotiate. I think, the members of Congress I've spoken to, I know many of them travel, many of them are going around the world and talking to people about these issues, and Spoke to one last night who was just in Beijing and met with Chinese officials for an hour and a half on North Korea loans. And I think that kind of message coming in a unified way from every single government official in the United States is very helpful, and also we've been telling all of our global partners coming from all of them.
You didn't address sanctions. I'm trying to,
Oh,
I think
that's
you're
right.
avoiding that, that's fine,
If
but I know my time is up.
I would be happy to quickly address, of course, we're
Go ahead.
grateful for the authorities that Congress has given us, and as I mentioned, the President has also signed the strongest executive order that we've ever had. I think that it's also incredibly important that we have the ability to remain flexible. We have to move and strike in our use of our economic powers according to what the intelligence is telling us will be the best targets to exact an enormous amount of economic pressure. And when our hands are tied in different ways, it keeps us from being agile in the way that you would want us to be agile in order to maximize that economic pressure. So we'd be happy to work, of course, always happy to work with the Congress on legislation. I would just caution taking away our ability to be flexible, because it inadvertently could decrease our ability to exert maximum economic pressure.
Senator Heitkamp.
Run through this quickly. Can we be effective in any kind of sanction policy or regime without total cooperation from China? Yes or no?
Look, I think total cooperation from China is key. Can we be effective? Absolutely.
But I'm saying, now I'm going to
Yes.
get to the point. Does the United States and the United States government and the Chinese government have identical, or at least wildly similar, goals in dealing with the Korean Peninsula?
So I think we do have broadly similar goals.
What would those be?
The Chinese government wants to see a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. That is one of their main key objectives. They also want there not to be chaos, war, and war on the Korean Peninsula for obvious reasons. It's right on their border. But their main goal for the current process is to denuclearize and rid the Korean Peninsula of those programs.
If that's true, then why isn't the Chinese government doing everything that it can to achieve that goal?
Well, I think that they've done a lot.
No, I'm talking about, full-on maximum effort, maximum restrictions on trade, maximum restrictions on doing business with North Korea. Why, if that's true, then why hasn't the Chinese government exerted the kind of authority and force on a diplomatic and on a sanction regime that would achieve that result?
It's hard for me to get exactly to inside what their policy process is and what they're thinking, but what I would say is that the calculus that they have about the line between war and chaos and getting to denuclearization might be slightly different than the line that we have, and that they seem to prioritize very much the the economy of North Korea is dependent on China, and so they have said that they want to make sure that the people of North Korea are not adversely affected. And of course, we don't want that either, but they seem to have a different calculation about that, is how I would.
I think that's the ultimate challenge here going forward, which is finding parallel purpose with the Chinese in achieving this result, and having a coalition of, extreme willingness to actually do everything that we can to achieve that result. And short of that, I guess, Secretary, short of that kind of collaboration and cooperation, how is this going to work to actually change behavior in North Korea?
Senator, of course, we are intent on working very closely with the Chinese to make sure that they are likewise maximizing economic pressure. We're in very regular discussions with them. We've seen some recent steps that they've taken that suggest that they are increasing the economic pressure that's going to be brought to bear, but we're monitoring it very, very carefully. And I think the authorities that we now have in the executive order also send the message that if countries, any country doesn't take this as seriously as we think that they should, then we will not hesitate to act. So it's partially working closely, coordinating, carefully collaborating as we are doing, but also sending the message that the President has sent, that Secretary Mnuchin has sent, that we're constantly sending, that where we think it's warranted, we're gonna continue to up the pressure.
If the Chinese government did everything possible, economically, with sanctions, with trade, with relationships, would it effectively achieve a deterrence from further progression in North Korea to acquire a nuclear weapon?
Well, Senator, that's the strategy. Time will tell. What we're trying to do is change the strategic calculus of North Korea, and we have to do that in concert with all of our partners around the globe. I can't tell you that it's going to change the calculus, but I can tell you that that is our ultimate objective, to achieve a denuclearized peninsula by changing that calculus.
And you believe that's the Chinese ultimate objective?
I can't speak for the Chinese. I can just tell you that they are working intently with us on this urgent matter.
Thank you, Senator Scott.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here this morning. In 1994, we struck the agreed framework with North Korea with the goal of eliminating the regime's nuclear ambitions. In 2000, President Clinton relaxed the sanctions under the assumption that North Korea was upholding its end of the bargain. In 2005, the United States, China, Japan, North Korea, Russia, and South Korea put out a joint statement celebrating North Korea agreeing to abandon its nuclear weapons program again. 2006, North Korea tested its first nuclear weapon. Since then, North Korea has conducted 5 more nuclear weapon tests and dozens of ballistic missile flight tests threatening American targets. I'll ask you both. If a denuclearization agreement is reached, how can we ensure that the Kim regime does not fool us again like they have over the last couple of decades?
Senator, I agree with you. That is the challenge. We are going to have to, if an agreement is reached, we are going to have to very carefully hold them to account. We cannot get to the same place, to the place that we are in today. And again, we would maximize the pressure that we've put on in a calibrated way to avoid the perilous situation that we are in today.
Care to comment?
Yeah, I think what we would have to do is make sure that we have the entire international community on board for the enforcement of the agreement, and it's very clear what the stipulations are in the enforcement, that we have inspectors in. It would be an intrusive inspection regime, and we would have to lay all of that out in the process of getting to that agreement.
Now, Senator Heitkamp started to talk about the Chinese influence on North Korea, and my last question goes in that direction. The President's recent executive order allowed Treasury and State to impose secondary sanctions on financial institutions who continue to do business with North Korea. But the President gave your departments discretion as to how to implement such measures and who to go after. That latitude you've been given is a deterrent to North Korea's enablers. Case in point, the same day the executive order was announced, the People's Bank of China told financial institutions to wind down their books of business with North Korean clients. I've previously made the point that our deep economic interdependence with China hurts our ability to incentivize them to take action. Did the simple threat of secondary sanctions bring about the bank's announcement?
Senator, I can't tell you what has motivated the Chinese, the various announcements that we've seen from the Chinese. I can only tell you that, again, we are continuing to work with them and to put pressure on them to take the steps that they need to take. And I think that the executive order sends a very important and careful message that if we see continued evasion of our sanctions regimes, that if we see banks not complying with their obligations to restrict this kind of activity, we won't hesitate to act. That, in and of itself, should be sending a very clear message to banks around the world.
Anything else? Good. Have the Chinese, this is of course in your opinion, I know that you cannot tell me what the Chinese think, I've heard you say that a couple of times, but my question is, Do you think the Chinese have come to a similar conclusion about the interdependence of their economic future on America?
So you mean, are they concluding because of the interdependence that they can stop short of fully implementing the sanctions?
I think the reverse of it. If they send 700 to 800 billion dollars of goods to America,
They need to comply.
part of their challenge is that they have a lot to lose if we shut
Sure.
down.
I think that's right. I think they care a lot about the relationship with the United States. They're very concerned about what's going on in North Korea and very concerned about what it implies for their picture, the strategic security picture in the region, and for them, for their own national security. And I think they also are determined to comply with the international sanctions regime that they voted for in the UN, and they've said over and over again that they will strictly implement the sanctions. And I think they care about being seen as strictly implementing the sanctions, and so that's where I think a lot of their recent efforts and initiatives have come from in concert with that.
Certainly seems to me if compliance of the North Korean regime flows through the actions of China, we should spend as much time delving into the relationship that we have with China to make sure that we do everything possible to control North Korea through that medium. Thank you.
Senator Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you both for being here. Secretary Mandelker, I was wondering if you have met with Adam Zubin yet.
I've met with Adam a number of times, yes.
I would recommend to you that you stay in contact with him, that you stay in touch with him. He has worked this side of the street for a long, long time, is extraordinarily talented, worked for both Republican and Democratic administrations, and is a patriot above all. And so whenever I have somebody who can help me as a resource, I try to use them. He would be a great resource for you to use. Senator Sass and I held a subcommittee hearing on this subject in May. One of the key findings was that our sanctions efforts can't be effective unless they're within a clear, comprehensive strategy. And in your written, Ms. Thornton, in your written testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on September 12th, you wrote in regard to the administration's strategy on North Korea, we're not seeking regime change or collapse, nor do we seek an accelerated reunification of Korea or an excuse to send troops north of the DMZ. My question is that this week there was a statement from the Commander-in-Chief that the North Korean regime won't be around much longer. How do we put those two things together, and how do we create a strategy when there appears to be two different programs rolling around here?
Thank you very much, Senator. So I think our strategy has a primary goal of denuclearization, and that's what we're working toward. The President's comments have been directed more at the issue of threats emanating from North Korea to our homeland and what would be our very reasonable and likely response to an attack from North Korea. So I think these two things are a little bit different, and I don't think that the clear statements that we're trying to make in order to make sure that the North Koreans understand what would happen if they made a miscalculation and initiated an attack on us or our allies, I don't think that undermines our declarative statement of our purpose in the negotiations and in the diplomatic process of being aimed at denuclearization and not the other things that you mentioned.
Secretary Mandelker, are our sanctions efforts undermined if they don't follow with a clear message as to what we're trying to achieve? Are we making that clear message?
Yes,
everybody?
Senator, I believe we are making that clear message.
Okay. Well, then let me ask you in regards to oil exports from China to North Korea. Where are we with that? What are our success opportunities with that? Will it be completely cut off, and when?
Well, that is in part up to the Chinese, but we are also, again, sending a message writ large that we will cut off or we are able and have the authority to target any company that's continuing to trade with North Korea in any industry. So that message is coming clear from the United States.
Isn't the oil exports the key sanction that's needed to get the attention of Kim Jong-un, to grind their economy up, to actually make a dent?
I think the oil exports certainly are very important, and we are not limited in our ability to target any company, any oil company that's continuing to do business.
No, I understand that, but the oil continues to flow, doesn't it?
It does continue. My understanding is that it does continue to flow, and I believe that it should stop.
And what are the plans over the next 5 months to dry that up completely?
Senator, I'm not going to prognosticate what our next steps are going to be. All options are on the table, and we're going to continue to aggressively implement our sanctions regimes. We're going to continue to deploy other economic tools that we have. We're going to continue to engage very seriously with our allies and our partners. We're going to continue to have discussions with China about measures that we think that they should take. We are also sending, as you know, an important message to financial institutions that they need to cut off any activity, ongoing financial activity with North Korea. And to that end, we're also having conversations with banks around the world about steps that we think that they need to.
Let me ask you about the 4 or 5 biggest banks in China. We've been able to obtain parts from some of the North Korean missiles. We know who makes some of those parts. We know the banks that finance the companies that make those parts that are on the missiles that are aimed at our friends and allies. We know the 5 most significant Chinese banks that are the parent banks or banks with relationships to these other banks. What are we doing to those 5 banks to put pressure on them to make sure that these parts are no longer built?
So, Senator, I'm not going to, again, prognosticate the next steps that we're going to take in terms of specific
Well, what
actions.
steps have you taken with those 5 Chinese banks?
As a general matter, the steps that we have taken are sending a very important signal through our action in June and now through this new executive order that we're not going to tolerate continued financial activity that helps to the Kim regime. And we are
have any sanctions been put on those banks?
Not on those banks, Senator, not at this time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cotton.
Ms. Mandelker, I've seen a report recently that says North Korea is the 4th or 5th most sanctioned nation in the world by the United States. Is that accurate?
I can't give you a comparative, Senator Cotton, but at this time we, the United States, have maximum authorities to go after any problematic behavior or activity, economic activity with North Korea.
Is there any reason why we shouldn't throw the kitchen sink at them economically, hit them with as much as we can, as fast as we can, as hard as we can?
That's exactly what we're doing.
Okay. Ms. Thornton, I want to turn to something you said earlier that I'm going to have to disagree with. And I think it's a fundamental disagreement, and it reminds me of what Yogi Berra said: if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. You said that you believe that China seeks denuclearization of the peninsula. I know that's what Chinese mouthpieces say to the United States and Western audiences, but I just can't agree with it. They claim that they're worried about a war that would lead to a refugee crisis on their border or a unified pro-American Korean peninsula. I just find this reasoning to be specious. Refugee crisis, say what you will about our country, I'm pretty sure that the Chinese government can build a wall on their border. And they've proven that they have a backup method to deal with a refugee crisis as well, tanks and 50 cals like they used at Tiananmen Square. Second, if they were really worried about a refugee crisis or a pro-American unified state on their border, aren't there numerous diplomatic measures they could take? I'm pretty sure that the United States would agree to no forced reunification, as we did with East Germany and West Germany after 1989. I'm pretty sure that we'd agree to no troops north of the current DMZ, that we'd work with the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees to set up refugee camps supported by the United Nations inside of North Korea. And then finally, I just look at China's actions. They blocked us from imposing those oil export sanctions at the United Nations Security Council a couple weeks ago. North Korea's economy has grown over the last 6 months. Trade with North Korea was up earlier this year. So all of these things suggest to me that when China says they want a denuclearized North Korea, they are misrepresenting their intentions. Because what would be the consequences for them if that were the case? North Korea would become like an isolated, weird Stalinist state the way East Germany or Romania was in the Cold War, but they wouldn't pose any real threat to the United States or to our allies in the region. And what would we be having hearings about? We would be having hearings about Chinese economic warfare and espionage against the United States. The Armed Services Committee would be having hearings about China's building and militarizing islands in the South China Sea. Senate Foreign Relations Committee might be having hearings about their near diplomatic embargo on Taiwan. So I would say that it actually benefits China strategically in their competition against the United States that North Korea remain nuclearized, and therefore they are not going to take steps to denuclearize North Korea unless the costs of keeping a nuclear North Korea exceed the benefits they get from it. That's my perspective on what China's motivations are here. I'd like to hear your perspective on mine.
So I think where I probably would not share exactly your assessment is what the Chinese assessment is of the security implications for them of a continued nuclear program in North Korea. And they are very clear that would there be a nuclear state in North Korea, that there would be nuclear proliferation in the region on their border, and that there would likely be a catastrophic acceleration in the breakdown of the nuclear non-proliferation regime in around the globe, and that has far-reaching security implications for them. So I think that's probably the place where I would have the most difference with the assessment that you mentioned.
And I agree that from a Beijing standpoint, that a nuclear Japan or a nuclear South Korea, both of which could probably achieve that aim in a year, maybe 2 years at most, would be detrimental to their interests. But if that's the case, why are they not doing the kinds of things that I just outlined? Why did they make us water down the Security Council sanctions? Why are they not seeking the kind of diplomatic agreements with the United States that would allay their concerns in advance of any effort to denuclearize, by force if necessary, North Korea?
Well, I think we've seen them adopt the most far-reaching UN Security Council resolutions that we've ever seen in the quickest amount of time that we've ever seen. I think it is a reflection of their growing concern. I think they change slowly, and they're getting increasingly concerned about the behavior out of North Korea and they're increasingly, it's becoming clear to them the implications for them, which they had maybe not fathomed clearly enough earlier.
My time's up. Thank you for the testimony. I just say, though, the consensus in Washington is that China is a partner in this issue. I do not think that's the case. They are a strategic competitor, and I believe that they see the current status quo as benefiting their interests as opposed to a denuclearized North Korea. And I think that our committee needs to take that into account as we're crafting any sanctions measures to bring more coercive pressure onto Beijing.
Thank you, Senator Schatz.
Thank you very much. Ms. Thornton, and I know you have to go at 10:30, so if I'm still talking, I won't be offended. First of all, what is U.S. policy with respect to the Korean Peninsula? Specifically, you say the primary goal is denuclearization. That's U.S. policy?
Yes.
Okay. When you say primary goal, does that indicate, should we infer from that that there is a secondary goal?
No, I mean, I think that is our overarching goal in our current strategy that we're bringing the maximum pressure to achieve.
So following up on what the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee said, that the intelligence community's assessment is that that is vanishingly unlikely. And I understand that you have to do what you have to do, and we appreciate it. But understanding that here we are with a State Department representative and a Treasury representative, and you're all, in your own way, doing that which is strategically necessary in your own lane. And yet we have an objective that may not be achievable at all. So I guess the question is, are there short-term objectives, setting aside that goal and whether or not we're going to argue about the extent to which it's realistic to denuclearize the peninsula, do we have a short-term objective that we're trying to achieve here?
Well, I think the objective is to change the calculus of the regime about their nuclear weapons program, and indeed show them that the cost of that program is unbearably high and that they won't be able to maintain it.
But that sounds like a long-term objective, and I guess it goes to my second question, which is it fair to say we're in a crisis situation right now?
Well, I think almost every high-level official in the U.S. government has noted North Korea as our most urgent and compelling national security challenge. So, you know, it has been said that the timetable that North Korea is moving on to develop its weapons program is much more rapid than we had foreseen, and that, you know, we're working as fast as we can and as intensively as we can to get sanctions regimes put in place and implemented. That's
Right,
why we
but
have this global pressure campaign. That's why we're engaging everybody in the world.
And I want to be respectful of your time. But those all still don't sound like crisis management enterprises. Those sound like I'm with you on the strategic objective of getting Kim Jong-un to change his calculus, but I don't see that happening in the next 3 to 6 months or even in the next 6 to 18 months. And yet we are in a crisis right now. So the question is the State Department, the Department of Defense, the White House, the National Security Council, in a crisis management mode which integrates that which we are doing for our long-term objectives, which, by the way, our intelligence community is now saying may not even be realistic. And the question becomes, we have these long-term objectives which have a, call it 30% chance of success. Many say 0. But whatever that percentage chance is, they have some low likelihood of success. But they also may have the unintended consequence of escalating the short-term crisis. And so I think we need to know what we're up to right here, right now, which is that all of this sounds good, and to Chairman Corker's point, it is incredibly politically satisfying for us to criticize China and to pass new sanctions and to do our oversight. But if we're in a crisis and the U.S. government's policy is to do something that most people think we can't do, then I think we're in a dangerous situation. And you compound that with the fact that you basically have 3 levers, right? You have the sanctions, which I think you're doing an incredibly effective job with. You have readiness, and then you have diplomacy. But then you have this commander-in-chief who uses belligerent rhetoric. And I don't want to ask you to comment on that because you work in the administration, but it has to be recognized that your strategy may work in another time with another president. But to the extent that you have coercive diplomacy and you've got bombers flying across to send, I think appropriately, the signal that we would be ready for any contingency, it's viewed differently if that is concurrent with a threat via Twitter that we're going to wipe them off the map. I mean, we can't view our strategy as separate and apart from what the President of the United States says. And I just ask you to consider the possibility that we are in a crisis and that the Commander-in-Chief says things that are not irrelevant to what we have to do. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Thornton, Senator Warren has asked if you could stay 3 minutes, and she's promised to stick to 3 minutes.
I promise.
All right.
Thank you. I appreciate your doing that, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, President Trump has made the North Korean nuclear crisis worse by threatening fire and fury, by vowing to totally destroy the regime, and by engaging in name-calling with an unstable leader in North Korea. The president's struggling to deal with North Korea, which already has nuclear weapons and is advancing its capabilities. But he's also about to create another crisis by suggesting that he may not certify to Congress by the October 15th deadline that Iran is complying with the nuclear agreement, which so far has prevented Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, the president has already certified twice that Iran is complying with this deal, and if he fails to certify again next month, then he could blow up the agreement and Iran may restart development of a nuclear weapon. I get it. Iran supports terrorism, engages in human rights abuses, works to develop ballistic missiles, but I think it's easier to counter Iran's destabilizing behavior if it has no nuclear weapon than it would be if Iran had a nuclear weapon. So, Ms. Thornton, if the United States causes the Iran nuclear deal to fall apart, would it make it easier or harder for us to resolve the North Korea nuclear crisis through diplomacy?
Well, I don't really want to speculate on a hypothetical, but I do think that it is very important to hold countries with which we have agreements to account for the implementation of those agreements. And in the case of North Korea and in the case of past agreements we've had with North Korea, we have seen that these agreements have been undercut by North Korean
Well, I understand you're concerned about their undercutting. The question is about our undercutting. So far, the Iranian nuclear deal is working. And my question is, if we blow that up, does it make it harder to get to an agreement that the North Koreans could believe in if we try to negotiate with them?
Well, our objective here is on denuclearization with the North Koreans. We know that they are engaged in a lot of other nefarious behavior that is concerning, but I think what we would want to focus on is that the agreement covers all of the provisions.
Okay, but I'm
needed to stop
asking about the
nuclear program.
relevance of blowing up the Iran deal on trying to get a diplomatic solution with Korea.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's speculation about what's going to happen with the Iran deal, and I'm not the Iran person, but we have, of course, the Secretary has certified compliance the last 2 times, so I can't get inside the head of the North Koreans and tell you how they look at it. But
Okay, I'll just quit because I promised I would by quoting Adam Zubin, who said, "Great nations do not play games when it comes to their international agreements. Doing so would be especially short-sighted when we're trying to convince the world to join us in a North Korea sanctions campaign whose stated objective is nuclear diplomacy." I think he's right, and I think President Trump would be wise to take his advice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and Ms. Thornton,
thank you.
you're excused, and thank you
very
for making the effort to be here today when you had this
for your
problem come up.
Thank you, Ms. Thornton.
Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Corker indicated in his questions that administrations, whether they're Republican or Democratic administrations, prefer for Congress to give them the maximum authority, but also the maximum flexibility. In fact, back in 2009, when Congress was considering the Iran sanctions legislation, the Obama administration indicated, quote, "The problem with congressional measures is that you can't turn them on and off as you like," unquote, similar to the response that you provided to Senator Corker. The Congress, nevertheless, on a bipartisan basis, went on to pass the Iran sanctions legislation, and as Senator Toomey said, I think there's strong bipartisan consensus here in Congress and also ultimately in the executive branch that those congressional sanctions backed up by the President's signature are what brought Iran to the negotiating table. Do you agree with that?
Senator, I think it was the full range of authorities from the executive branch and the Congress that brought Iran to the table. And of course, we welcome working closely with the Congress on these critical issues.
Right. But the distinction, you've made it many times this morning, as did Secretary Thornton, is between authority and implementation. And you both indicated that enforcement and implementation is the key right here. And the question is whether we are fully implementing those powers. And the purpose of having sanctions like the Iran sanctions legislation is to make sure there's a constant driver there. Have you had a chance to look at the UN experts report from both February and then the interim report that lists a whole bunch of Chinese firms and banks and from other countries that they assess to be violating the UN sanctions? Have you seen that?
I have seen the panel of expert reports, and we have taken some action based on those reports. But the importance for us is that we have the ability to remain agile, so that the Treasury Department can deploy our economic authorities and tools in the way that's going to maximize our strategic
Look,
impact.
I understand. I mean, it's another version of we want a lot of authority with maximum flexibility. But I think the question is whether we need to do more. I think that it was premature of President Trump to sort of heap some congratulations on, President Xi. I understand we want the Chinese to work with us. As Secretary Thornton indicated, they've been, quote, and I'm quoting here, the leading enabler of North Korea. And as of today, there are a whole lot of Chinese banks or firms that we believe are continuing to violate the sanctions. why aren't you naming those banks? Why aren't you identifying them publicly? Even if you're not taking action against them now, isn't there a benefit in publicly shaming those banks that are engaged in that kind of activity?
So, Senator, in June, of course, we did name the Bank of Dandong, which we thought was a gateway of funding that was going to North Korea. We are very actively monitoring the activity of the banks. We have this forward-looking authority to allow us to impose secondary sanctions. We take that authority very seriously, and we will continue to deploy our economic tools in the way that we think enables us
Mr. Chairman,
to maximize
look, I
economic
appreciate
pressure.
that. I mean, the executive order could have been issued day one of this administration, right? I mean, there's nothing that would have stopped you from doing that. So if I could, Mr. Chairman, put in the record the full list of the entities that were identified in the interim report of the UN panel of experts that continue to evade sanctions.
Without objection.
All right. The Bank of Dandong is one, right? And they've got over 58 here. There are others that I know that you've targeted. But the point is, if we're serious about getting China to work with us and cooperate, we got to increase the leverage. And I understand the desire for maximum authority combined with maximum flexibility from the Congress. But I also think on a bipartisan basis, most people agree that it was ultimately the sanctions legislation that sent a message that we are very serious about making sure we implement these sanctions going forward. So I believe that there's a lot more we can do. This is why Senator Toomey and I have introduced legislation really patterned after the Iran sanctions legislation, and I hope, Chairman and Ranking Member, we can move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I noticed it seemed like when Senator Schatz was talking with you and kind of giving his perspectives, you wanted to respond. I'm going to open that up to let you respond.
Thank you. I think Senator Schatz was asking what are our short-term and long-term objectives. One of our short-term objectives, of course, is to cut off all revenue streams to North Korea, to keep it from having the ability to continue to fund its WMD programs. And that is what we are constantly intent on doing, whether it's deploying our sanctions effectively, going after the revenue streams, or mapping out their efforts to evade sanctions, understanding how they use front companies, financial facilitators around the world. And we are tactically deploying those authorities and tools and using our intelligence in a way that will provide maximum strategic impact. That was what I was going to continue to say. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is one of many hearings we've had, and thank you very much, and to the chair and ranking member. During those hearings, some have argued that imposing secondary sanctions on entities doing business with North Korea could cause the North Korean regime to collapse. Do you have concerns that imposing secondary sanctions could cause that collapse?
What we want to do is change their strategic calculus. We're not seeking a collapse. We're changing a change in their strategic calculus so that they stop